they would have to confront by aiding this person, perhaps trying to stop the aggression. And I find that this is the very position that we're in today with our country here. So many people would like to stop this war, but without paying any kind of a personal price themselves. That's one of the big differences.
Really, that analogy, we'd only stop to think about it, is exactly what's happening in our country right now. That as a nation, we are raping and killing and violating another nation or other nations and some of our own people in this country. And we're doing this and we're standing by. We're not doing anything about it. We're lamenting it, like every one of those people in that apartment building was, I'm sure, was lamenting it. Isn't this too bad? Oh, poor girl, what could I do about it? And we don't dare call on the police or on anything because we can't find what to call. And we don't want to get involved because of all the legal situations that it would bring upon us. And we're standing by with our arms folded. I think even if you attempt to do something, even if someone had gone down and started screaming to stop what was happening, it would have had some value in the fact that that person was doing something concrete. And right now, this is what's happening by our nation, ourselves. If our country is truly a democracy, it's really ourselves doing it. And yet,
I think that the very question that you raised, Marge, has to do with the very topic of the anatomy of violence that this series of programs is investigating. Because not only are we investigating the anatomy of violence in many forms, what is man's basic nature, what does history say about this, but we're also interested in how can those who are committed to human potential for a cooperative and constructive society, how can such persons make a breakthrough? How can we get out of the web of violence and break through and help others break through to a more peaceful and cooperative type of society? And I think that in terms of the ecumenical character and spirit of this program, where instead of attempting to set up a debate and see who can win, that rather we're attempting to reach out to persons such as you and our other guests here today who are at the forefront of this cutting edge which is attempting to break through into a peaceful type of social order, that your trial, which is coming up on October 7th, which was based on the action that you and Tom and Mary, as 3 of the Catonsville 9, entered into the draft board at Catonsville, Maryland, removed the 1A files, and burned them with homemade napalm. I think that this is such a dramatic act which is brought before the attention of the whole nation, and with the trial bringing this up, that Bob Raines and Rabbi Mintz and myself would like to hear from you the type of thinking which went into this action, what came out of your personal histories and so forth that led you to it. But before we get into that, I wonder, Rabbi, if you would be willing to state your concern about this whole area of what is the most effective way for those who are so moved to resist war.
John, the question that I have to raise is really somewhat of a theological one. To those of us who come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, the concept of confronting oppression and of opposing tyranny is inherent in that religious tradition. And every time we stand over and against the power structure, the government, or any group of people whom we believe to be practicing oppression in one form or another. We take a posture which we call prophetic, for certainly that was the history of the prophet, to stand over and against the power structure of his community and to demand justice from that power structure. But there was a dimension to the prophetic that sometimes I feel is lacking in our own posture today. The prophet spoke out of a tremendous concern and a tremendous love for his people and for his nation. And he confronted that people and its power structure, usually one-to-one, articulating at one at the same time his love of people, his love of country, his love of God, while at the same time castigating them for violating their own ideals, for violating the covenant which really formed the foundation of their nationhood. And the question that I would like to raise with you today is how, granted our own position over and against that of our government, how we can demonstrate at one and the same time our love of people, our love of nation, and our real desire to elevate the nation to reach out for its highest ideals and for the most noble that is within it. That's a long-winded question.
Yeah, well, you know, I think when you're talking about a prophet in biblical times confronting the power community on a one-to-one basis, the power community today is a little differently set up and certainly much stronger and more entrenched than it was in biblical times. And I think no one could prove love better than to say, you know, we want these people to live as human beings. We don't want them to die from napalm or starvation because of the defoliation and chemical warfare in Vietnam. And how else can you prove that you love people? But I think, too, part of love, when you love a person or and it's mostly people, I mean, I find it a little hard to talk about loving a thing, but a group of people like a country or a nation, you confront them in love, not because you hate them, but because you want them to realize their potential, or to have the best, meaning in human terms, not money and things, but to realize their potential as humans. And so you say, you know, prophecy really is saying that the signs of the times are pointing this way. And you're saying, in effect, to America, that in the destruction of Vietnam, in the foreign policy in Latin America and the rest of Asia, and sometimes in Africa, we are not only destroying people physically, but making it impossible for them to live as human beings, nothing else. And here at home, our own poverty community, the whites, the blacks, the Mexican Americans, the Spanish Indians, migrant workers, all these people also are asking to live as human beings, to have the things, food, shelter, etc. And we're saying to the country, you know, it is an inhuman course you're following. We cannot go along with it. But we're not saying it in hate. We're saying the fantastic potential that is here is being turned in the wrong direction towards something that's inhuman. And we're saying, can't we come back and look at ourselves and see what we really are, and then grow from there? Admit what we are now and grow from there.
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I don't think we need to be embarrassed about the form of love in terms of righteous indignation against injustice. The Bible is shot through with this. Mm-hmm. And as I was thinking about your particular action in napalming the files, the draft files, when you think about what Jesus did in the temple, I mean, that was property. It was the temple property, and he overturned those tables. That is, he damaged the property, and he damaged the very property that, in his judgment, was being used to exploit the pilgrims coming to worship. Now, it seems to me that it's a very analogous kind of thing. That is, that this is precisely the sort of thing that the prophets, and Jesus in particular, did in his circumstances. And it would seem to me to be parabolic in terms of what you're doing.
Yes, I think that it's important because of the big hang-up we have on private property in this country to underscore the concept that our right to private property is relative. It's not an absolute right. We have an absolute right to our physical, mental, moral integrity. And what we need for that integrity, property, our control of nature, our share of nature, the products of nature, is only relative to that. Now, when we use our private property, whether it belongs to the government or another individual, if that property is being used to destroy the integrity of another person or group of person, he loses his right to the property, just as the murderer has no right to his gun. And if I have to go and take that gun away from him to stop him from murdering somebody, I'm going to do that. Now, how do you, I feel, if you want to get into the justness or unjustness of this war, it's another concept, but once you are committed to the concept that the war is unjust, although it is very complicated, you have to take a position to do what you can to stop that war, while in the same time trying not to violate other people in the process. Now, that's what we in effect did in burning these draft files. We felt that the government has no right to the draft files, which is the key to the selective service system, which in turn pulls in boys from all across the country who are politically unaware of what our country is doing abroad and sends them over there with a flag in one hand and a gun in the other to kill people who don't know what this struggle is all about, and lots of times just want, as we've seen in Guatemala, just want the right to a piece of land so that they can support their wives and children. And so how do you stop the American army, or how do you stop the government, or how do you stop the ruling class? We haven't found that answer, but we made a small little attempt by burning some files, and we were very much surprised how people can get so upset about burning $100 worth of paper while they'll stand around and watch hundreds of thousands of people murdered by our government's policies, not only in Vietnam, but in many other nations, by economic imperialism also.
Tom, did your work with the Christian Guerrilla Front in Guatemala and your insights into the role of property in maintaining oppression in that country, did this contribute to your insights which led you and Margie to join with the Catonsville Nine in selecting the property of the selective service system as something to be symbolically attacked? Was there a definite evolution or connection between your experience and actions in Guatemala and your act in Catonsville?
No question about it, John. Let me just a little insight to what we went through in Guatemala that brought us to the position of burning these draft files after being out of the country for 10 and 13 years respectively and being back for 1 month. One of the people working with me in a cooperative in Guatemala, one of the leaders, came up to me one day and he says, "Father, what would have been the obligation of the Good Samaritan if he had a little faster mule?" And of course we kind of don't expect these questions very often from these simple little people. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, what if instead of coming around the bend in the road and finding that guy from Jericho there half dead, having fallen among the murderers and thieves, that he came around the bend in the road and he found those guys beating hell out of him? What would have been his obligation?" Well, I knew what he was looking for, and an easy out, I said to him, "Well, what do you think would have been his obligation?" And he said, "Well, you're constantly telling us, you seem to be telling us, that we should wring our hands over the whole situation and say, 'Isn't that awful?' But just stay clear of it, and you've got to advise either one side or the other that they're exceeding their just bounds of the utilization of physical force." I'm using terms, of course, now that he certainly didn't use. But I said, "Yeah, I guess that has been what I've been telling you. He says, well, I think that we're obliged to get in there and try and stop them. He said, now, in doing that, you take the chance of getting killed. Or maybe even the fellow that you're trying to help gets killed. Or maybe one of the fellows who's doing the job gets killed. You don't want that. What you're trying to do is stop this fight. But he says, I think that we're obliged to attempt that. And if in attempting it, some other effect comes out, well, that's not your fault. We're human beings. And he says, and yet, you seem to be telling us all the time that we should just stand back and kind of say, well, this is awful, when I think that we've got to do something about it. And this is the kind of thing we're witnessing. And of course, to relate this mentality to Catonsville, we found that our government in Guatemala was supporting the 2% that is the ruling class in Guatemala with arms and helicopters and military advisors and all kinds of money. And any kind of a popular movement down there, when it becomes at all effective in uniting the migrant workers, for instance, the leaders start disappearing. In the last 2 years, 4,000 people have been murdered in Guatemala. And they have peasant leaders, cooperative presidents, labor union organizers. And our government is supplying the munitions and the men and the technical advisors for this kind of thing. And under the concept that all these people must be communists, and if they're not communists, they'll be manipulated by communists very soon. So anybody who cries out in the name of social justice automatically is a communist, and therefore he's marked for death. And so we felt very bad about this, and when we thought that we would join in the movement that was trying to combat this, we were asked to leave the country by the American ambassador and our religious superiors for interfering in the internal affairs of Guatemala. And we came back to this country, and we were very much impressed by the anti-war sentiment in this country, which we hadn't heard about in the Guatemalan papers. And we said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could tell people that Vietnam is not a sickness, it's only a symptom. And there's another symptom, perhaps not so visible, but in Guatemala, and in Bolivia, and in Peru, and God knows how many more countries. We've got soldiers in 44 nations around the globe. And before we start another Vietnam in Guatemala, we've got to reach the people who are already upset about Vietnam. We figured that the other folks that still think that we ought to bomb Vietnam off the face of the map, that we could never reach them and get them upset about Guatemala. So we had to do something very symbolic, effective, and when we heard of this action, we decided we wanted to participate and give it another dimension. That it would, although it was written up in the papers, a bunch of kooks protesting the Vietnam War, which we do protest because I'm sure there's a lot of good peasant Vietnamese being killed because they just want a little bit of say about what their country should be. We wanted to say, well, Vietnam's not the only problem.
Margie, your involvement in the Christian Guerrilla Front in Guatemala, I assume that you started out independently and at a certain point came into contact with Tom. Did you follow a parallel path, or did you become involved in some other way?
No, I would say it was parallel in the sense that I was working with a group of university students that became very concerned about their role in their country and what their contribution should be. And they decided that it should be labor organization in the sense that they felt that there they could contribute in a constructive way to helping people organize and live better. And as soon as they did, they were confronted with the fact that they were teaching people and preparing people to die. Because as soon as any cooperative or labor league gets started, the leaders are threatened and very often killed. So that's when they came to the confrontation. What should they do then? Let these people be killed or ask protection from somewhere? Where from? Or protect them themselves? And you come to that point. It's, again, the same idea of the Good Samaritan in that sense, that what do you do when you come upon or you see around you your friends and your brothers and your mother and your sisters being killed, and maybe yourself, as a Christian, you could stand to have something happen to yourself. But what do you do when you see weaker brothers and sisters around you? You can't just stand back and let them suffer. You have to do something. And it's our condition right now. I mean, we're seeing this happening all around the world, in our own country. Do we stand back and say, well, we can't do anything about it? Or do we really step forward and say, I'm going to do what I can?
This is a difficulty I have with a lot of the people who have the nonviolence as their quadro of action. And as a Christian, again, I say, as Marge, that, okay, Christ told us to turn the other cheek, which I may or may not gladly do, but I mean, I know that that's what I should do. But can I allow somebody else, or must I oblige somebody else to turn his cheek? Am I not obliged if someone is being hit on one cheek and then on the other and then again back? Am I to say, well, be a good Christian and keep taking that? Or am I supposed to be the good Christian and get in there between them and try and stop the thing as best as I humanly can? Perhaps complicating sometimes the situation, which we must recognize, but you have to do something. This agonizing, as so many people do, I can't buy that position.
Yeah. Now, there's the question, of course, of, of effectiveness in terms of what changes the policy that one opposes, and then the question of witness, that is, bearing one's own personal testimony. Mm-hmm. I'd be grateful to hear your own thinking through these questions, this question, in terms of how effectively can we stop the war in Vietnam? And from some of our earlier conversation, Tom, you were indicating wondering whether what you have done is effective or will be effective in the way that you had hoped, and yet feeling quite convinced that this was nonetheless, whether it's immediately effective or not, it was the right thing for you to do in terms of your own conscience.
Yeah, well, Bill Coffin made a distinction which kind of straightened out a few things for me. He distinguishes between Christian hope and pragmatic optimism. And we found in talking about our action to so many people that they're wondering, well, does something like this stop the war in Vietnam? And I don't think that any of us thought before getting involved in this action we were going to stop the war in Vietnam. But too many people want to be pragmatic, who feel, again, uptight about the war and want to do something to stop it, and they must equate, or they are equating, a particular action with a very given co-equal effect. And if they can't see that concrete result of that given action, then they prefer to take no action. And we say that, okay, we can be pragmatic and try and be optimistic that in doing this, that there will be this given result, which will eventually lead to the end of the war, but in a fast termination of the war. But you also have a position which I feel is a position of any Christian who understands what Christian morality is all about, that to be true to his religious concepts and true even to his concepts of what he is as a man, a human being, that he must stand up and be counted in a very, well, I'm kind of confusing the issues, I think, by saying effective way, but he must take an effective action even though the action is not effective, in the sense that he hopes that his action will be effective. But even with the idea that perhaps it won't be, he still, in order to maintain his own Christian and human integrity, must do something to stop what he considers a moral evil. And again, I would think it would be something like Christ, you know. He ended up crucified, and everybody said, well, what a failure. What a waste of a life, you know. But we see now, in looking from the perspective of history, that his failure was his greatest success. And perhaps in our action, in getting an awful lot of people to agonize over what we've done, the government too questioning us and having to drag us into court and parade us before people and why we did this and why couldn't we have done something else, that we will make moral people in this country face the issue, which will eventually, we hope, snowball into terminating this evil. But even if it doesn't, I don't think we could have done anything else.
Tom, you've raised the question of effectiveness on two levels. On the one hand, you raise it in the area of what you would call Christian witness. Mm-hmm. Now, it would seem to me that one can witness to his moral posture and to his religious conviction within the frame of reference of law. That is to say, even if he takes the stance of what we might best describe as a selective conscientious objector. That is to say that he refuses to have any part of this particular conflict and is willing to face the consequences of that particular posture. That in order to answer the question as to how one maintains his integrity and maintains his own religious posture, he need not go beyond the realm of law, or it certainly need not go beyond the realm of involving others in the violation of law. And it would seem to me that that represents the highest example, the sacrifice that the man himself makes in being willing to face the consequences of his position bears adequate witness, and I would tend to believe more effective witness to the populace at large than an overt act of resistance, of public resistance.
Chuck, I'm not quite sure I get what you're saying in this sense. Say a young man of draft age.
Right.
Now he says, I'm not going to have anything to do with this Vietnam War.
I
Well,
refuse
how
to
does
serve.
he? Yeah, all right.
I refuse to serve.
Well, that involves him in breaking the law,
It involves him
right?
in making a choice, but puts a monkey, if you'll permit my using the expression, on the back of the establishment to raise the question, what are you going to do with this man who, out of deep conscience, and without trying to stir up a populace, other than to say, here I am, a symbol to all you out here, how is the establishment going to handle him? I say this bears witness.
Sure. But he has to break the law to do it.
He breaks the law and stands conversely ready to accept the consequences of his violation.
Yeah. I thought you were saying he didn't have to break the law.
I'd like to speak to this point as a World War II conscientious objector. I went through an evolution of my own development in this area where, first of all, I registered completely within the law as a conscientious objector and was sent to a work camp operated by the Quakers, which was out in a rural area remote from any social impact. After being there a short period of time, I began to realize that I really had complicity in helping the Quakers isolate people from a more effective impact in not only stopping the war, perhaps, but even bearing witness. We were simply accepting voluntary compulsion to go out of circulation, so that at that point I requested transfer to a government camp, which was operated directly by the federal government. And after spending some time there, and this, of course, involved dialogue and discernment with all the other men going through the same process, again, we realized that we were, in effect, voluntarily removing ourselves from impact and confrontation of the war-making establishment. So at that time, I felt moved in conscience in terms of my own commitment to escape from or leave that camp, return to the urban centers of decision-making and so forth, and attempt to enter into a dialogue and confrontation with those who were supporting the war, which I in conscience was opposed to. At that point, I ran into a federal prison sentence, and it was necessary then to oppose the work program in the prison, which was the only thing which remained. But what I'm attempting to do, Rabbi, is answer your question in a very existential way that theoretically you can say, well, why not take this position? But when you start entering into a process, at each stage of the way, you somehow see that you have an option to take the next step. And I think that those who do enter into this process, whether it starts in Guatemala or Africa, find themselves almost compelled in a practical sense to move on to the next step. In this connection, I'd be interested in hearing from you, Mary.
I have two questions I'd like to redirect to you. I think when you referred to the conscientious objector, you said, yes, he broke the law, but he was willing to take the consequences. Right. I don't know if you were aware that we waited for the police, and that this is part of the whole action. You know, we understand the consequences and accept them. And secondly, I think the conscientious objector is objecting to a particular war. Now, the thrust of our action was much more than the Vietnam War. We're saying that that is the most obvious sign of the illness of America. But the imperialism overseas and the suppression at home is also part of it. And also the world situation certainly shows that there is an international movement of people opting for life. You know, the Paris students, the German students, the Mexican students, etc. And that's all part of it. So we're not just talking about a just or unjust war. We're talking about a world situation.
I think, too, Rabbi, that this is the point that was brought out by the campesino who talked about the Good Samaritan's mule. Is it enough not to participate in evil, or do you, when you are seeing evil? And again, this is the question for those people in New York City who see someone beating up somebody else, an old man on the street or an old lady. Aren't you obliged to confront that evil and do what you can to stop it?
Well, I would tend to think first that as you stand in objection to and refuse to participate in the war, that you have confronted that evil. I would think, on the other side, when we talk in terms of effectiveness among the masses of Americans, the question of a symbolic act such as the destruction of the draft card files, draft files, almost inevitably will bring a negative effect on the part of that of the mass of that population.
But you're not speaking, I mean, I don't think...
I assume that the act was perpetrated primarily to have an impact upon masses of people out there.
To have an impact, yes, but when you speak to people, you are implying that they will listen.
Correct.
So what you're doing is confronting masses
You're getting
of
their
people.
attention, for
Yes,
one thing.
but speaking to a much smaller group, if you know what I mean.
Well, isn't there another dimension to this, that you are not setting up a model or a stereotype
No.
which those who wish to resist war are to follow? Rather, you're raising a question in conscience, calling them to face themselves and who they are and how they fit into this picture, to look at their immediate circumstances and what options are available to them so that they can take the best possible action themselves, which may cover a whole variety of possibilities.
Including lawful acts, like
Right.
you brought out yourself.
I was going to bring up the idea that the fact that of the action that we did, it is very jarring to American mentality that has this big sense of property as being very sacred, and you just don't touch it.
I don't think the question here is
No,
one of
but-
property. I think it's a question
Well,
of...
what was it? What were we destroying?
I think what was being attacked
Yes.
was the authority of government to act in a given way. It wasn't the piece of paper
Well,
that
that's-
threatened the government or that threatens the citizenry. It is the act of defying the right of government.
You know, I think that's sort of subtle for the majority of people. I don't think they come to the conclusion from our action. I mean, certainly I haven't had that experience in speaking to people. I think they're much more simple and more direct. They find it difficult to know how we went ahead and destroyed something. And that's their question. And they don't go any deeper than that. They don't go into the point that we were, in a sense, telling the government, look, we don't agree with what you're doing. And that brings me back to that question you originally posed about a prophet's role in speaking with love of country as one of his basic elements. And for myself, and I know that I do think I represent the other 9 up to a point in this. I wouldn't want to say it completely. But that certainly love of my country, love of the United States, was a great impulse for me in doing this, in the sense that I have great hopes for our country that it still be in some way a democracy, in the sense that I do wish that all our people would have a say and would be willing to take responsibility for our government, for our actions. And I think we've come to the point, you know, through habit and through just letting things go, that we've left our voice to be heard only as far as elections go, and even then we're beginning to doubt if we really are heard at that point, at that level. But certainly in the things that really matter, we have no say in our country. And this is a confrontation in love, not to, a line on a map. That isn't my country. My country is all the American people. That's what it really means. And I'm trying to tell my American people, look, we really want to be a great nation, not a powerful nation. And if we're going to be a great nation, we have to consider other people. We have to be I mean, not stuck in all these other things and washing our hands from responsibility, but saying we want to have a say. And certainly, when I was burning those files, I was thinking that to myself. I'm saying it. If nobody understands it, if nobody interprets it correctly, at this point, I'm saying it. And certainly, I know in my heart that I've said it.
You raise an interesting question that Mary had alluded to earlier. She had indicated that picketing and protesting and marches are no longer an effectual means of protest. And you two are saying very much the same thing in terms of catalyzing what you hope will be the democratic processes among the populace of this country. You're saying that only by an act outside of the democratic process can you catalyze that process into action. And I wonder, I'd like to raise this question with you as to your faith in the potential of popular democracy in this country. Is it merely a pipe dream? Can we hope to achieve just and idealistic goals through this process? Or does it always require a posture that goes outside of the process itself in order to activate it?
I'm not too sure what you refer to when you say the democratic process.
Well,
For me, I'll just say this. For me, democracy is really what Abraham Lincoln traditionally said. It sounds beautiful theoretically, and probably the application of it is where we get into trouble. But it should be a government by the people. It should be the people of this nation making known their will in some way. And I think right now we don't have an effective way of making known our will.
I think we have to distinguish between our form of government, which technically is a Republican form of government, not a pure democracy in the Greek sense. And I think that, to me, democracy includes the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights. It includes freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, in the broadest sense of the term, even if this be confrontive of the particular structure. So that I think that in the deepest sense of the term, any human political act is democratic. I realize this may get into a semantic definition of terms, but it's hard for me to conceive of an individual citizen concerned in conscience about a policy or act of government in speaking and acting to this as being undemocratic. I think it's in the highest American tradition, which in the very establishment of the Constitution, this, what I would call the other half of the democratic element, was left out. And quickly, the Constitutional Convention had to be called and the Bill of Rights installed, so that this very creative tension between human rights as expressed in the Bill of Rights and property and political rights as expressed in the body of the Constitution was restored, just as it was presented in the Declaration of Independence. So that I think that there's a danger of somehow seeing as un-American something which is directed towards political and property rights in the body of the Constitution, when actually this is directed in the whole spirit of the Bill of Rights, which to me is the highest sense of American democracy, in which I have my hope and love of this country.
Aren't you also saying that finally your highest authority as one who loves his country, whether as an American or whatever country, your highest authority is not your government, but is your God? And as Peter says, you know, we must obey God rather than men. And while 99 and 44, 100% of the time, we find ourselves in good conscience obeying the laws of our country as we would want to do, that we reserve always the religious dimension of obedience to conscience. And I think that part of the outrage, as you say, Chuck, comes from people feeling that somehow, or equating disobedience of a law with disobeying God. That is, that as though God were ensconced in the government, and to disobey the government is morally wrong because he's made that identification.
Can I say something here that is just kind of a very personal observation? I don't know how far I would dare push it, but having been brought up in Catholic schools, Catholic seminary, and ordained priest, of course we were always taught that the ultimate authority here on earth was the Pope, religious authority. Now, since the Second Vatican Council, and we're seeing some very dramatic effects of some of the concepts of the idea that the validity and the the sanctity of the individual conscience and the Pope's absolute authority now, we find historically it wasn't so absolute. It was more an authority that the Pope was the spokesman for, that rested in the whole church, in the whole Christian community. And so we've been, in the last few years, myself personally, in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, have been able to come to grips with this and replace my concept of where God and his authority lied. Instead of lying in the person of the Pope, he lies in the great community of man, the great Christian community. Well, now, all of a sudden, I've also seen that we had a very parallel experience here in America with, perhaps because of the government we've had, perhaps one of the, or the greatest government that man has ever been able to fashion for himself. But we've all of a sudden equated to that government a type of, or not all of a sudden, it has built up an infallibility, that it could not be wrong. And with this reorientation that I've had personally about where my religious conviction should direct me, I find that I'm no longer caught up with the idea that perhaps President Johnson is Almighty God, that in talking to an awful lot of Americans, I think they do confuse our president with Almighty God and our flag with the crucifix, and they really don't have the concept that our government could make a mistake. They've made out pretty well under this government, and they think they understand the tyrannies and miseries that other governments have exercised against their own peoples, and they've felt none of these things themselves. And so they somehow come to the conclusion that, well, this is the best and there is nothing greater. And I find this a little bit incongruous now that I've been able to come to grips with this concept of papal infallibility, that I now have to face it on a civic level, again, that our Pope, that Johnson, every action and thought of his is infallible, and you can't make a mistake, you know. And, well, as I say, it's just kind of a personal observation. I don't know how far I'd want to push it, but...
But it would seem to me that what you're also saying, and very really, is that you lack a confidence in the American people as well, never mind in the power structure per se.
In a certain sense, I am lacking confidence in the American people, because today, more than ever before, our country is relating to foreign countries. You know, with our democratic system and our republic, we have been able to come to grips with most of the problems that our country has faced internally, with the exception perhaps of the black problem and the Mexican Americans. But I mean, listen,
keep going.
You know, what I mean is, I don't know what the percentage would be, but 75 or 80% of our people have gotten a fairly good deal from our government. But now our government is relating to other peoples as they've related to us in the past. And there are very few people in this country who understand that relationship and what this government is doing. And it's really the men, we call the masters of international finance, and the top men there in the Pentagon that know just what our country is doing abroad. And so most people, if we were doing the kind of things in this country that we're doing in Guatemala and Vietnam, our people would be up in arms about it. And this is why even the black movement in this country, people can accept a lot more stepping out civil disobedience in the name of the black movement, because they can actually see the injustices and they can come to grips with it much more than they can. We start talking about Guatemala, most people don't even know where it is. They figure it's over there in Southeast Asia, right beside Vietnam, between Thailand and Vietnam, you know.
I think you put your finger on the pulse of things, though. I think when you say that the American people as a whole are much more amenable to active participation in the civil rights struggle, it is because that they believe that that cause is essentially just, that they have had experience and that they have had enough exposure to believe that whatever their particular position on the spectrum, that the thrust of this country is toward the resolution of the race problem, and you're entirely correct in saying that they never heard of Guatemala. And it would seem to me that within a democratic process, our job ought properly to be to so inform them. I might add that in Vietnam 3 years ago, certainly it was true that the overwhelming majority of the American citizenry was either unconcerned or what you might call hawkish on Vietnam. That certainly is not the case today. Whatever the percentages, there is a tremendously significant minority of our people who are actively engaged through the democratic process in trying to do all that they can to get us out of that mess. And I think here again, it is largely because through the democratic process, an educational job has been done on our populace.
I'd like to disagree again. That's all what you said. I think that I'm not entirely in agreement with your statement that the American public is all gung-ho to go work for civil rights. I didn't really think
I didn't
that...
say gung-ho.
Well, you know, I think that not too much of their attention ever was directed there, and certainly less of it is directed there now than ever before. I think, too, we forget that the middle-class people in America are really in a bind themselves, not only because economically their jobs are threatened by influxes of black people or Appalachians or Mexican Americans or whatever, but also because the setup of American life is so different today. And we used to live, you know, in small towns and farms, and we had, you know, sort of a rural mindset. Everybody knew everybody, and there was security because there were not too many strangers around, et cetera, et cetera. There was a routine to life. And now, of course, most of American life is concentrated heavily in urban areas. It may be suburban to some extent, but generally it's an urban thing. And we still are not quite sure how one lives humanly in a city. I mean, I think Ardrey in his book brought up he thinks what we're witnessing today is the deterritorialization of man, meaning he has no territory to defend. So I think it's many, many things, and I think through technology and everything, their lives are being tremendously affected, sometimes in the threat to their jobs, sometimes in the fact that more things are available that were never available before. But in actual fact, in all aspects of their life, things are changing.
Granted.
So in religion, you know,
Also.
everything's changing. You know, there's no more rock to cling to.
Right.
So they are much more concerned to react to things close at home. The preservation of a way of life, which to them is very important, and values, which to them are very important. And the denial, in order to preserve these values, of circumstances in Vietnam or in Latin America or in the poorer areas of this country. So, you know, they don't know where Guatemala is, and they're not really anxious to know, you know, because that's just one more problem. But I think the thing is, the whole world is so small now. We communicate with each other so rapidly. We travel back and forth. What happens in other countries affects us and affects the other country much more than it ever did before. And it is, in the end, going to affect them.
Mary, with the rich fabric of commitment that we've developed here, which have led to this action of the Catonsville Nine, and with the fact that the trial is coming up on October 7th, to bring this down to earth again, concretely, in terms of those who have been reached by your speaking and by your writing, I'm mindful of the article which appeared in the Ramparts magazine, which referred to you as the Lives of the Baltimore Saints. I don't know how you felt about that. Maybe.
We thought it was overdoing it.
But in terms of
Early
the fact that
canonization.
the trial is coming up, and you have spoken to people, in terms of those who are responsive to what you're doing and who are willing to act supportively, what type of effective action do you see could be taken by groups in Philadelphia, New York, Washington, Detroit, etc., who have heard what you were saying, have seen this rich fabric of commitment and thought which has gone into it? How would you see people responding positively to further the effects of your action with respect to the trial? Are groups coming to attend the trial?
Yes, we hope that that all those people who have express sympathy with our action, but because of personal commitments of their own. Somebody, I mean, George Mishi, the only one in the group of the 9 of us who has dependents outside the group, his wife and small child, has made a great sacrifice, but the rest of us more or less just put our own bodies on the line. And there are so many people around the country who have said that they feel very deeply about what our country is doing, and they'd like to participate in some action, but it could mean the losing of their job or ending up in jail, and they just can't see how they could cope with that kind of thing and take care of the responsibilities they have. And so if we've spoken for them, we hope that they'll show up at the trial to let the government know. And this is part of the democratic process, you know. I think an awful lot of people look upon our action as a threat to the democratic process, and we prefer to regard it as a safeguard of the democratic process, in that we do not feel that our government in this question is responsive to the people. Johnson himself said last year, if his popularity goes down to less than 1%, that he, as long as he is president, is going to pursue the policy that he has already begun in Vietnam. Now, where does the democratic process come into a situation like that? We want our people to have something to say about this government. And if we're going to play the game according to the rules set down by President Johnson and Dean Rusk, that means the effectual murder of tens and hundreds of thousands of people, we just aren't going to go to people and sit down and try to educate them in a very calm, cool fashion so that we can vote in a new president and draw up new laws so that we'll control the situation. At the same time, people are being killed, and I think this is what we forget, you know. People say you can march and you can write letters, and I just wonder if there are American boys being killed over there, but if there were a lot more of them, if our cities were being bombed, this is another thing that we don't seem to understand, you know. When Harriman went over there to Paris, he said, how are you going to reciprocate if we stop bombing North Vietnam? And the Vietnamese said, well, we won't bomb the United States. And they made fun of him, you know. I think that if perhaps some of our cities were being napalmed and bombed, it would have a contrary reaction to the one I would hope. But nonetheless, a lot of the suffering would come home, and then the people would understand our own anguish anyway for wanting to see this thing over as soon as possible. And if we feel that the government can cope with letter writing and marches and demonstrations, but find it rather difficult to cope with the burning of draft files, then we've got to burn draft files.
I would say there about, you know, you asked what people could do.
Yes.
I think a lot of people agree with the causes or the reasons for our protest, but they might not agree personally with the exact type of action that we took. And I certainly respect that. And if anybody doesn't agree with that or wouldn't do that himself, great. But please do something. I think that's the essential thing. And if they find another way that's even better than what we did, marvelous. I'm sure there must be better ways. I just haven't been able to find it. But if other people know a way, it's their responsibility to do it. The terrible thing is when people say, there's nothing I can do. And they just wait and wait and wait. So my invitation would say, show your support of the reason for our protest, not necessarily for our type of action. And as you show your support, be willing to do something. Now, whatever you do, the situation is so drastic that whatever you do is going to cause you personal pain and discomfort. It's not going to be something easy. If you wait for the something easy, amen. You'll have to be willing to take a risk, and you'll have to be willing to, you know, to put yourself on the line for it. But each one can find what he has to do. And our invitation is that it's urgent and it's necessary that every American see his position and his responsibility and respond to it.
I don't think there can be any argument with this or within this group, and I certainly think the challenge is a legitimate one that you're throwing out right now.
I think this is the big difficulty, the last point there. We've met so many people who would like to do something to save this situation without paying any personal price. And I think that's being unrealistic. That in order to confront the powers that be and anyone who wants to right a wrong, to break the back of injustice, has to first call some of that injustice down upon himself. I mean, you can't face the forces of injustice and hope to come away with nice and clean.
You know,
And if you're not willing to pay the price, the personal price, whether it be your sweat or your freedom or your job or even your life on occasion, then you're not really as upset about the situation as you would like to think.
I was going to say that, you know, to come back to the religious motivation behind all this, because there certainly was, it was there. And I just remember Christ's speech to the Pharisees and the scribes. You know, if we translate it into present day terms, we wouldn't believe that it was Christ who was doing it. When the Pharisees and the scribes being the lawmakers of his time and the accepted people in religious circles, and he's called them brood of vipers, white-walled sepulchres. If we call our moral leaders, our religious leaders, for their silence, brood of vipers and whitewashed sepulchres, I mean, it would certainly be valid if they have been silent about moral issues. But his criticism of the Pharisees at that time was that they were putting burdens on other people that they weren't willing to support themselves because they were living above the conditions that they were, you know, imposing on people. And if only we'd really be able to see Christ's message as a prophet and translate it into our present time, not, you know, leaving it back there. I mean, that's real simple. He lived way down there, you know, and, well, it's nice to read about him. But if you really tried to translate it into our present day, it's a terrific challenge.
I think it is.
You know, and we find from ecumenical dialogue that all too many Christians are prone to put an anti-Semitic interpretation on that accusation of the authorities of those times instead of seeing it as a criticism of all authorities
Right,
and calling
right.
into question of all authorities.
Well, I think the Rabbi brought that out at the beginning when he talked about the other prophets. You know, whether you regard, I think even in the Jewish community, you regard Christ as a prophet, wouldn't you? At least that he had something to say to the Jewish people.
There is a dichotomy of view here, but frankly, I and many like me would certainly agree with you that Christ was in every sense a prophet. I would not get ready agreement to that statement within the Jewish community.
Yeah, well, I didn't
Well-
mean to put you on the spot at all, Rabbi, but I think in your reference to the other prophets that one of their primary role was confronting the powers that be with the injustices of their acts and the fact that we just don't accept their injustices.